Late on the morning of October 5, 2007, an American flag rose slowly into the autumn sky above a quiet park along the Potomac River just south of Washington. A bugler played. A ceremonial cannon fired a single shot. About 24 elderly men, most of them in their 80s and 90s, stood with their hands over their hearts and watched. Some were weeping. They had not stood on this ground since the final months of the Second World War. For 62 years, they had been forbidden to speak about what they had done here. They had kept that promise. They had not told their wives. They had not told their children. They had not told their closest friends. They had carried the secret toward their graves. And now, at last, the United States Army had released them from their oath. The place was Fort Hunt, Virginia. During the war, it had no name on any public map. It was identified only by a mailing address. Post Office Box 1142, Alexandria, Virginia. Behind that anonymous box number lay one of the most consequential and most successful intelligence operations of the entire war against Nazi Germany. 3,451 enemy prisoners were brought through its gates between 1942 and the summer of 1945. From them, American interrogators extracted intelligence on submarines, jet engines, rocket science, infrared weapons, atomic research, and the inner workings of the Third Reich itself. They produced more than 5,000 intelligence reports by the end of August 1945. They did this without breaking a single bone. They did this without a single waterboard. They did this without raising a hand. And the men who did the work were, in many cases, the very people Adolf Hitler had tried to destroy. To understand what happened at Post Office Box 1142, you have to understand what the United States Army built there, and the long, peculiar history of the ground itself. Fort Hunt sat on more than 150 acres of riverbank that had once belonged to the Mount Vernon estate of George Washington. The Army began acquiring the land at Sheridan Point in 1893 and built a coastal artillery fort there beginning in 1897. In 1899, President McKinley named it for Brevet Major General Henry Jackson Hunt, the Union Army of the Potomac's Chief of Artillery at Gettysburg. Massive concrete gun batteries faced the Potomac to defend the approach to the capital. By the early 1920s, the guns had been removed for European service in the First World War, and the post lay nearly empty. In 1933, the property was transferred to the National Park Service and folded into the new George Washington Memorial Parkway. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the United States entered a war it had been preparing for in private for years. Within weeks, military intelligence planners realized they needed something they did not yet have. They needed places to hold and question the highest value enemy prisoners on American soil, far from the front lines, far from the press, and far from the eyes of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The British had been doing this since 1939 at a country house outside London called Trent Park, where Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Centre officers had perfected the art of comfortable captivity, hidden microphones, and patient conversation. American officers had visited Trent Park during 1941. They came home convinced that the British model worked. On May 15, 1942, the Department of the Interior signed over Fort Hunt to the War Department for the duration of the war plus 1 year. Within months, the empty park was transformed. 87 temporary and permanent buildings rose along the river. Barracks, mess halls, latrines, officer quarters, interrogation rooms, a converted post hospital, watchtowers, 2 perimeter fences of barbed wire, guards posted at every gate. The whole compound carried no sign and no flag visible from the road. Local residents in nearby Alexandria grew used to seeing unmarked buses with darkened windows rolling past their houses at all hours. They never asked. They never knew. In the spring of 1943, the war was reaching its decisive turn. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had broken Japanese carrier power in the Pacific. The German Sixth Army had surrendered at Stalingrad in early February 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic was about to swing decisively in the Allies' favour through the brutal summer that followed, as American and British escort groups, long-range patrol aircraft, and improved sonar finally began to crush Karl Donitz's submarine fleet. The first prisoners pouring through the gates of Post Office Box 1142 were U-boat crews, men pulled from the cold Atlantic after their submarines were sunk. They were exhausted, soaked, often wounded, and almost always astonished at where they had landed. But by 1944, and into 1945, the prisoners arriving at Fort Hunt were of a very different kind. Generals, admirals, diplomats, engineers, scientists, rocket designers, radar specialists, senior officers of German military intelligence. The Reich was collapsing, and as it collapsed, its most valuable secrets walked through the gates of a quiet wooded park in Virginia, less than 15 miles from the White House. The mission of the place rested on 3 secret programs operating side by side, sometimes separated only by a fence. The first, the Strategic Interrogation Center, was known by its code name MISY. It was a joint operation of the Army's Military Intelligence Service and the Office of Naval Intelligence. MISY interrogated the high-value prisoners and produced the bulk of the intelligence reports. The second program, MISX, was modeled on the British MI9. MISX helped American servicemen escape from German prison camps. It smuggled silk maps, miniature radios hidden inside baseballs, compasses concealed in uniform buttons, currency, and playing cards that could be peeled apart to reveal hidden maps. These items moved into German camps inside parcels, marked as gifts from fictitious aid societies. The ingenuity of the MISX workshop deserves a closer look. The escape and evasion specialists at Fort Hunt produced compasses no larger than a coat button, with the magnetic needle balanced on the head of a tiny pin, so finely that it would still function after being sewn onto a uniform and shipped halfway around the world. They produced silk handkerchiefs printed with the road networks of Germany, Austria, and the Low Countries, foldable down to the size of a postage stamp and undetectable inside the lining of a pocket. They worked with the United States Playing Card Company in Cincinnati to produce decks of playing cards that, when soaked in water, would peel apart into 2 layers and reveal a section of an escape map printed between them. They concealed miniature radio sets inside hollowed-out baseballs and hairbrush handles. They built radio crystals into the heels of boots. They produced silver and gold coins of foreign issue, sewn into the linings of fictitious aid parcels that could be used as bribes by an escaping aviator. The entire workshop was housed inside the renovated old post hospital at Fort Hunt, in a building Park Service maps now mark only as Picnic Pavilion A. The operation was so secret that the post commander himself was not cleared to know about it. It was commanded by Colonel Catesby A.P.C. Jones. By the end of the war, MISX had aided more than 700 successful escapes and roughly 10,000 evasions of capture across occupied Europe. The third program, the Military Intelligence Research Section, translated and analyzed captured German documents, newspapers, journals, and personnel files. From this section came a thick, color-coded reference book called The Order of Battle of the German Army, which Allied interrogators in the field used like an oracle. By March 1945, the Red Book edition gave any American interrogator near total knowledge of any German unit a captured soldier might come from. The man who ran the post for most of its active life was Colonel John L. Walker. The post commanders rotated, but Walker held the position from February 1, 1943 to July 18, 1945, the period of the program's heaviest output. Even he did not know everything that happened on his own base. The escape program operated on a need-to-know basis so strict that the post commander had no access to it. Now we come to the men who did the actual work. They were among the most extraordinary group of soldiers the United States ever fielded. They were known, collectively, as the Ritchie Boys. Their training ground was a sprawling former Maryland National Guard camp in the Catoctin Mountains near Cascade, in Washington County, Maryland, close to the Pennsylvania border. Its name was Camp Albert C. Ritchie. Secretary of War Henry Stimson approved its conversion into the Military Intelligence Training Center on May 26, 1942. The center was activated on June 19, 1942, with the first 8-week course starting the following month. Across 31 classes through the end of the war, the school graduated approximately 19,000 military intelligence specialists, with about 1,200 counterintelligence corps personnel additionally trained at the site. Among them, by the most careful estimate, were approximately 2,000 Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria. These were young men who had escaped the Reich as teenagers in the 1930s, sometimes with their parents, sometimes alone on the children's transports to Britain or on ships to America. Their families, in many cases, had been left behind to die. They had grown up speaking German. They had grown up in the same cities, the same schools, the same coffee houses, and the same soccer leagues as the Wehrmacht soldiers they would now interrogate. The United States Army had quietly realized that this was the rarest and most valuable resource in the entire intelligence war: men who could think in German, men who could reach across the table and speak the language of childhood to a captured enemy. There was a problem. By American law, men born in Germany or Austria were classified as enemy aliens. Technically, they could not be permitted to interrogate German prisoners. The army solved this with a brisk legal shortcut. Buses ran from Camp Ritchie to a federal courthouse in nearby Hagerstown, Maryland, where a friendly judge naturalized the soldiers as American citizens on the spot. Many also Americanized their names. A young man born Gunther Stern in the German town of Hildesheim became Guy Stern. A young man born Gunther Dienstfertig in the German city of Breslau became John Gunther Dean. A young man born Paul Schoenbach in Berlin became Paul Fairbrook. Some of them scratched the letter H, which marked them as Hebrew, off their army dog tags and recut it as a P for Protestant, in case they were ever captured. The training at Camp Ritchie itself was unlike anything else in the United States Army. The 8-week curriculum compressed an entire intelligence education into roughly 50 days. There were courses in interrogation of prisoners of war, in close terrain reconnaissance, in aerial photo interpretation, in counterintelligence, and in the order of battle of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, down to the level of individual battalions. Trainees memorized German uniforms, insignia of rank, vehicle silhouettes, and unit shoulder boards until they could identify a soldier's division at a glance. There were field exercises in which instructors dressed in captured German uniforms staged ambushes, surrendered, refused to surrender, and feigned wounds, while the trainees had to react in real time and conduct interrogations in the field under stress. A stretch of woodland on the Camp Ritchie grounds was set up to resemble a German village, in which whole scenarios were rehearsed. And there was the famous moment, repeated for every class, when the trainees were issued American uniforms and told that they were now soldiers of the United States Army. For many of the refugees, who had crossed the Atlantic only a few years earlier with nothing but a single suitcase, that moment was unforgettable. Only about 12% of the Army personnel on the Fort Hunt rosters had passed through Camp Ritchie. The rest came from other intelligence and language pipelines, and many Ritchie boys themselves went forward to the front rather than to Post Office Box 1142. But the men who did arrive at Fort Hunt formed an unforgettable cast. Henry Kohm, born Heinrich Herbert Kohm in Vienna, who would after the war become one of America's leading physicists and a pioneer of magnetic levitation at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. John Gunther Dean, who would later serve as United States Ambassador to Cambodia, Denmark, Lebanon, Thailand, and India. Harold George Mandel, who would chair the pharmacology department at George Washington University for 36 years. Arno Mayer, the Luxembourg-born scholar who would teach modern European history at Princeton for half a century. Peter Weiss, who arrived at Post Office Box 1142 in 1945 at the age of 19, after his colonel in San Antonio asked him whether he could speak German, and Weiss, on the spot, recited a long stretch of Goethe in reply. Rudolf Pins, born in Germany, fled in 1934 at the age of 14, both of his parents murdered in the Holocaust. George Frenkel of Kensington, Maryland. Werner Moritz, a survivor of Buchenwald in 1938, who arrived at Fort Hunt in July 1942 with the very first cadre. These were the morale officers. That was the cover title used inside the camp. They were never to call themselves interrogators in front of a prisoner. They were to be friends, hosts, fellow Europeans, men with whom a tired and frightened German officer could speak in his own language about chess and music and the soccer leagues of the 1930s. The methods, when you look at them closely, were astonishing in their patience and in their humanity. There were essentially 9 of them, layered one over the other. Before any of those methods came into play, however, there was a careful sorting process that most prisoners never saw. Captured German soldiers, sailors, and officers did not arrive at Fort Hunt directly. From May 1943 onward, Many were first screened at a forward holding camp in the Miko State Forest of central Pennsylvania, adjacent to Pine Grove Furnace in Cumberland County, about 126 miles north of Fort Hunt. The site, originally a civilian conservation corps camp during the Great Depression, became a key American interrogation gateway, through which roughly 7,500 German and 160 Japanese prisoners passed during the war. Only those judged to hold strategic intelligence, scientific expertise, or unusual access to senior leadership made the trip down to Post Office Box 1142. The rest were sent on to ordinary prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States. Selected prisoners were then driven by bus, hooded or behind blacked-out windows, to Fort Hunt, often arriving disoriented and unsure even of which country they were in. Inside the gates, they were stripped of personal effects, given medical exams, allowed to shower, issued fresh clothing, and assigned to single or double cells. Those who cooperated quickly graduated to the privileged side of the camp, with its movies and pool and steak dinners. Those who resisted were placed in the bare cells, where the microphones did the work the interrogators could not. The first was hospitality. Cooperative prisoners received good food, plentiful tobacco, and access to alcohol. They were taken to use the swimming pool at nearby Fort Ward. They were taken into Washington in civilian clothes to see films. They went on shopping trips downtown. The kitchen staff, including a Pennsylvania native named Dominic Marletto, recalled the policy plainly. They would give the prisoners whatever they wanted, just to get them to talk. The second technique was rapport. Henry Colm explained it after the war. The interrogators were called morale officers, he said, and they were to interrogate people in the friendly pretext of a chess game, or a ping-pong game, or a tennis game, because a prisoner was far more likely to talk in a friendly meeting over a chessboard than in a room where he was being formally questioned. They never worked the other way, Colm said. They took care of the men, and it was a friendly thing. The third technique was personal cultural connection. The Ritchie boys at Fort Hunt knew Germany the way the prisoners knew Germany. They knew the soccer rivalries of the Rhineland, the regional foods of Bavaria, the cabaret songs of 1920s Berlin, the streetcar numbers of Hamburg. Guy Stern, who served mostly with the frontline interrogation teams in Europe but trained alongside the Fort Hunt men, used the technique constantly. Encountering a prisoner from the city of Dusseldorf, Stern would say, with friendly enthusiasm, that he was glad to talk to someone from Dusseldorf, that the city's soccer team had been at the top of the league at mid-season. The prisoner would relax. The prisoner would talk. The fourth technique was the hidden microphone. Every cell, every common room, every mess hall, every latrine, and even certain selected trees along the outdoor walking paths were wired for sound. Werner Moritz once recalled discovering bugs the size of a small watermelon hidden inside the overhead light fixtures. He once heard a prisoner say to his cellmate, "I am getting a funny echo here. I think we are being recorded." The prisoners then took the lights apart and found the microphone. Moritz remembered it as a very, very embarrassing situation. Pre-war German anti-Nazis among the prisoners were sometimes recruited as informants, placed in cells with hardline officers to draw them out. Rudolf Pins estimated that only about 20% of what he monitored was useful intelligence, the rest being talk of girlfriends and complaints about sergeants. But that 20% was extraordinary. The fifth technique was the illusion of total knowledge. With the Red Book of the Order of Battle of the German Army at his elbow, an interrogator could greet a captured colonel by reciting his unit, his last battle, the names of his immediate superiors, and the recent movements of nearby units. The prisoner would conclude that the Americans already knew everything, and that there was therefore nothing to lose by filling in the few gaps. It was a careful illusion, built from the patient document analysis of the Military Intelligence Research Section, combined with the cumulative output of every interrogation that had come before, and it broke the resistance of more captured German officers than any other single tactic in the program. The sixth technique was the Russian threat. Two Russian-American officers at the post, Alex Shidlovsky and Alexander Dalin, would put on Soviet uniforms and appear at certain interrogations. Rudolf Pins explained how it worked. Shidlovsky and Dalin would dress as Russian officers and attend the interrogation. The Americans would play good cop. The choice put to the German prisoner was simple. Cooperate, and he could go to a comfortable American prisoner of war camp at Fort Meade in Maryland. Refuse, and he could be transferred to the Soviet Union. Pins remembered the answer the prisoners always gave. The seventh technique was rank matching. Fred Michel, a German Jewish refugee from Landau, recalled wearing officers' insignia equal to or one step below the rank of the prisoner he was interrogating. The reasoning, he said, was that Germans respected rank. A captured colonel who saw himself sitting across from another colonel was far more willing to speak as one professional to another. The eighth technique was no notes. Across the entire Ritchie Boy program, interrogators were trained never to write while the prisoner was talking. A pen on a notepad made the prisoner nervous and made him stop. The interrogator listened, and only later, alone, dictated everything he had heard. The ninth and most important technique was the absolute prohibition on physical violence. This was not a mere preference. It was the whole architecture of the program. Brandon Byes of the National Park Service, who would later interview more than 70 of the surviving Fort Hunt veterans, summarized his findings plainly. To his knowledge, there had been no torture at the camp. The question was asked in every interview. There was no evidence that anything remotely resembling torture had happened on the grounds. Among more than 3,400 prisoners, the program produced one famous quote that carries the whole moral argument in a single sentence. It came from Henry Colm, speaking to reporters around the time of the 2007 reunion. "We got more information out of a German general with a game of chess or ping-pong," Colm said, "than they do today, with their torture. Now we have to look at what they actually got. The intelligence yield of Post Office Box 1142 is not a matter of myth, it is a matter of paperwork." Thousands of intelligence reports preserved today in the National Archives. The early waves came from the Battle of the Atlantic. The Office of Naval Intelligence compiled the results of U-boat interrogations into thick booklets called post-mortems, sent directly to fleet commanders to refine anti-submarine tactics. From these interrogations, American analysts assembled detailed operational pictures of the Schnorchel, the breathing tube that allowed German submarines to recharge their batteries while submerged, then being installed across the U-boat fleet. They learned the design and behavior of the new G7 EST-5 acoustic homing torpedo, known to the Germans as the Zaunkönig, and first used in September 1943, against which the British and Americans deployed the towed noisemaker decoys called Foxer and FXR. They learned about radar decoys and other technical countermeasures. One of the most dramatic episodes involved the German submarine U-515, sunk by an American hunter-killer group north of the island of Madeira on April 9, 1944. 16 of the crew died. 44 were captured. Her commander was Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke, a famous U-boat ace who had been credited with sinking some 22 ships, totaling more than 140,000 gross register tons, and who held the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. British radio had falsely accused Henke of machine gunning the survivors of a sunken liner, the Ceramic, in December 1942. American interrogators used the threat of extradition to British custody as leverage. On May 3, 1944, the surviving crew of U-515 arrived at Fort Hunt by army bus. Henke was repeatedly threatened with handover to the British. On June 15, 1944, the day before he was scheduled to be transferred, Henke walked deliberately to the wire of his enclosure in broad daylight, ignored the guards' shouted warnings, and began climbing the perimeter fence. He was shot and killed as he reached the top. It is the only death recorded inside Fort Hunt during the war, and the men who interrogated him believed it was a deliberate suicide. He is buried at Fort Meade Post Cemetery in Maryland. A still more famous submarine, U-505, was captured intact by an American hunter-killer group on June 4, 1944, the first enemy warship boarded and seized on the high seas by the United States Navy since the War of 1812. To protect the secret of the submarine's intact codebooks and Enigma machines, the 58 surviving crewmen were not held at Fort Hunt at all, but at Camp Ruston in Louisiana, in such absolute secrecy that the German Navy declared them dead, and they were not repatriated until the years following the German surrender. Fort Hunt interrogators were sent to Bermuda to question selected prisoners there. In May 1945, in the very last operation of the war, the giant Type 10B cargo submarine U-234 surrendered to an American destroyer escort, the USS Sutton, on May 14, and docked at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on May 19. On board was an extraordinary cargo. Drawings of the V-2 missile, the Messerschmitt 262 jet aircraft, and the Henschel 293 glide bomb. Two Japanese naval officers, Lieutenant Commander Hideo Tomonaga and Lieutenant Commander Genzo Shoji, who took their own lives during the voyage rather than be captured. Lieutenant General Ulrich Kessler of the Luftwaffe, en route to Tokyo as air attaché. And roughly 540 kilograms of uranium oxide, somewhere between 1,200 and 1,235 pounds, packed in lead-shielded containers, whose exact form is still debated by historians. Among the passengers was a man who would prove to be one of the most valuable scientific captures of the entire war. Dr. Heinz Schlicker, a Korvettenkapitän of the Kriegsmarine, director of the German naval test fields at Kiel, and one of the Reich's leading specialists in radar, infrared technology, and electronic countermeasures. Within 5 days of his arrival, Schlicker had revealed the existence of infrared proximity fuses on board. On May 25, 1945, he was flown to Portsmouth with a 3-man bomb disposal escort to recover them. He was later moved to Fort Hunt, where he was personally befriended by John Gunther Dean. He was repatriated briefly in 1946 and then brought back to the United States under Operation Paperclip, where he worked first at the Office of Naval Research on early stealth materials and then at the Allen Bradley Company in Milwaukee, eventually writing a foundational textbook on dielectromagnetic engineering and being elected a Fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. Lieutenant General Ulrich Kessler, who had also been aboard U-234, was interrogated extensively at Fort Hunt during the summer of 1945. He had been on his way to Tokyo to serve as the Luftwaffe's air attaché to the Japanese Empire, and he had spent decades inside the inner circles of German military aviation. The interrogation reports filed on Kessler, preserved today in the Donovan Nuremberg Trials collection at the Cornell University Law Library, run to dozens of pages of single-spaced typescript. They cover the personalities of senior Luftwaffe commanders, the bureaucratic politics of the Third Reich, the relationship between the Luftwaffe and the rocket program, and detailed appraisals of figures Kessler had known across his career. The reports were used as raw material at the Nuremberg trials and remain among the most detailed primary sources on the inner workings of the German Air Force. 2 other named prisoners deserve special mention. The German diplomat Gustav Hilger, who had spent decades in Moscow as the Reich's leading Russian specialist, and who had been present at almost every major German-Soviet diplomatic encounter from the Treaty of Rapallo through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was brought into American custody in 1945 and debriefed extensively on the Soviet leadership. His knowledge of Stalin's inner circle and the personalities of the Kremlin made him one of the most consequential debriefings of the early Cold War. Werner Moritz, the Buchenwald survivor at Fort Hunt, also gave a striking oral history account decades after the war about a wartime encounter with the Nazi propagandist Julius Streicher, the publisher of Der Stürmer, whose paper had spent more than a decade publishing anti-Semitic incitement that helped prepare the ground for the Holocaust. Moritz's own mother and sister had been murdered during that genocide. According to his own admission years later, he briefly lost control during that encounter and locked Streicher in a shed. Historians who have examined the records of Streicher's actual capture in May 1945 regard the surrounding details as contested, and Streicher was eventually delivered to the Allied detention center at Mondorf-les-Bains and then to Nuremberg, where he was tried, convicted, and executed in October 1946. Across more than 3,000 prisoners and 3 years of operation, even with men whose families had been destroyed by the regime they were now interrogating, the standard every other day of the war was discipline. Then there was the rocket program. Fort Hunt's analysts, working with British colleagues, contributed to the broader Allied intelligence picture that identified the German rocket testing facility at Peenemünde on the Baltic island of Usedom months before the first V-2 struck London. That intelligence picture set the stage for Operation Hydra, the Royal Air Force Bomber Command night raid of August 17 and 18, 1943, in which 596 aircraft dropped roughly 1,800 tons of bombs on the rocket complex. United States Army Air Force's daylight raids followed in subsequent months. Later analysis identified the underground V-2 production site at Mittelwerk near Nordhausen. The rocket men themselves came at the very end. Wernher von Braun, the chief designer of the V-2, surrendered with his brother and the core of his Peenemünde team in May 1945. Von Braun and the first 7 of his senior technicians arrived in the United States on September 20, 1945, at the Newcastle Army Airfield in Delaware. Their main scientific debriefings took place at Fort Strong on Long Island in Boston Harbor, an Operation Paperclip processing site under Army intelligence auspices, with Fort Hunt interrogators participating in the questioning. Arno Mayer was assigned as a morale officer to the German rocket team, and it was Mayer who escorted scientists on shopping trips into Washington, including the famous excursion to the Landsberg's department store, where von Braun barked back to a confused lingerie clerk that he wanted underwear made of wool with longer legs. Roughly 500 German scientists in total moved through Fort Hunt and its satellite sites under Operation Paperclip. Von Braun would go on to design the Saturn V rocket that carried Apollo to the moon. The single most consequential prisoner ever held at Fort Hunt itself, however, was a man very few Americans would recognize. His name was Reinhard Gehlen. From April 1, 1942 until April 1945, Gehlen had been the head of Foreign Armies East, the German military intelligence service responsible for the entire Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. He had buried his archives in waterproof drums in the Alps before the collapse. He surrendered to the United States Counterintelligence Corps in Bavaria on May 22, 1945. Initial interrogations took place at Camp King near Oberursel in Germany, conducted by Captain John R. Boker. Then, on September 20, 1945, Gehlen and 3 of his most trusted aides were quietly flown to Washington on an aircraft provided by General Walter Bedell Smith. They spent roughly 10 months at Fort Hunt under unusually comfortable conditions, housed in private quarters with a butler and orderlies, before Gehlen's release in July 1946. He went on to rebuild his Eastern intelligence network at Pullach, near Munich. It was paid for by the United States Army G2 and from 1949 onward by the Central Intelligence Agency, with annual budgets that would eventually run into the millions of dollars. The Gehlen organization that emerged from those Fort Hunt months became, in 1956, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the Federal Intelligence Service of West Germany. Some historians have called the deal struck during those months the secret Treaty of Fort Hunt. It is essential to understand what kind of war was being fought around all of this. The contrast with the Gestapo's interrogation methods, with their cellars and their wire, and their casual brutality, is total. So is the contrast with Imperial Japan, whose treatment of prisoners of war included the Bataan Death, March of April 1942, the slow starvation of Allied prisoners on the Burma-Siam Railway, and the medical atrocities of Unit 731. And yet, in one of the strangest ironies of the war, on the German side of the European air conflict there was one very different establishment. The Luftwaffe Interrogation Center at Oberursel, near Frankfurt, run by a master interrogator named Hans Scharf, used almost exactly the same rapport-based, non-coercive methods as Fort Hunt. A November 1945 United States Army Air Forces report on Oberursel found that Scharf and his team had largely adhered to the Geneva Convention of 1929. After the war, Scharf was invited to lecture American Air Force interrogators on his techniques. Both sides of the European Air War, working independently, had reached the same conclusion. Kindness, given enough time, will outproduce torture every time. That was the wartime story. The post-war story is in many ways stranger. When Japan surrendered on August 14, 1945, the men of Post Office Box 1142 knew their war was over. 6 days later, on August 20, the Military Intelligence Service section in charge of the escape program received a directive ordering the destruction of its records within 24 hours. Photographs taken by Fort Hunt veterans show piles of documents being burned in the days that followed. The Strategic Interrogation Center wound down through the following summer. Most of the post's wartime buildings were bulldozed by the end of 1946, and on January 1948, the property reverted in full to the National Park Service. Trees grew back. Picnic pavilions replaced the barracks. Families came on weekends to barbecue. Every single soldier who had served at the post had signed a written secrecy oath. A copy of one such oath, signed by the Buchenwald survivor Werner Moritz, is preserved today at the National Archives. The men went home and said nothing. Henry Kolm went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and built superconducting magnets. John Gunther Dean entered the Foreign Service and rose to become ambassador in 5 capitals. Harold George Mandel went to George Washington University and trained generations of pharmacologists. Arno Mayer became one of the most prominent historians of modern Europe at Princeton. Rudolf Pins moved to Honolulu. George Frenkel went home to Maryland. Werner Moritz settled in North Carolina. Fred Michel built a quiet life in Louisville, Kentucky. They told no one, not their wives, not their children, not their neighbors. Wayne Spivey, who had been the chief clerk supervising the information gathered from interrogations, said later that he had never told his family because he did not think anybody would believe him. The records were declassified in waves, beginning quietly in 1977 and continuing through the 1990s. But no one ever told the men. They continued to honor a 60-year-old promise that the United States government had long since released them from. In 2001, the German military historian Sönke Neitzel, working in the British National Archives at Kew outside London, stumbled on transcripts of secretly recorded German prisoner conversations from the Trent Park program, eventually amassing roughly 150,000 pages of related material across British and American archives. Working with the social psychologist Harold Welzer, Neitzel produced 2 landmark books, Tapping Hitler's Generals in 2007 and Soldaten in 2012, which transformed historians' understanding of the Wehrmacht's inner culture. In the early years of the new century, an Air Force interrogator named Stephen Kleinman submitted a master's thesis at the Joint Military Intelligence College titled simply The History of MISY. It was the first scholarly synthesis of the declassified record, but the men were still silent. That changed because of a young park ranger. Around 2006, the chief ranger of the George Washington Memorial Parkway, Vincent Santucci, asked his cultural resources specialist, a 27-year-old named Brandon Byes, to research the wartime history of Fort Hunt for new interpretive signs. There was almost nothing to work with. Then, on a public tour of the park, a National Park Service ranger mentioned the gap in the record. A visitor on that tour, an older woman, said her neighbor in Louisville, Kentucky, had been an interrogator there. The neighbor was Fred Michel. Byes tracked him down. Michel said yes, he had worked at Post Office Box 1142 during the war, and he would love to tell Byes everything about it. But he had signed a secrecy agreement. Santucci took the matter to Army counterintelligence. The Army wrote individual letters to every veteran the Park Service could identify, formally releasing them from their oaths and asking them, please, to share what they knew before it was too late. The Washington Post journalist Petula Dvorak broke the story in a long article on August 19, 2006, with the headline, A Covert Chapter Opens for Fort Hunt Veterans. The reunion in 2007 that followed brought roughly 24 survivors back to the park for the first time since the war. National Public Radio's Pam Fessler aired a 3-part series in August 2008. CBS News and other outlets followed. Between 2006 and 2010, Brandon Byes and his Park Service colleagues, often with Stephen Kleinman as a subject matter advisor, conducted full oral history interviews with about 70 surviving veterans. Their voices, transcribed and recorded, are now permanently preserved in a National Park Service archive available to any researcher. At the reunion in October 2007, John Gunther Dean, who had flown in from Paris, said, "For 63 years, nobody ever said thank you. It was very nice to receive recognition that what we had done was being recognized as helpful to our country," George Frenkel said. "During the many interrogations, I never laid hands on anyone. We extracted information in a battle of wits. I am proud to say I never compromised my humanity." Across the Potomac, that very week, the President of the United States was defending the use of so-called enhanced interrogation in another war. The contrast was not lost on the old men in the park. Frenkel, when asked, said he had been very distressed by the fact that Americans, with their humanitarian heritage, would engage in waterboarding and similar practices. He called it horrible. Rudolf Pins, in Hawaii, told a CBS interviewer something that was both old soldiers' wisdom and a moral testament. You do not get people to talk by beating them or waterboarding or anything of that nature. If you make life for certain prisoners fairly easy, they will relax. Today, where Fort Hunt's barracks once stood, There are picnic tables and a paved loop road. Children ride bicycles past the concrete remnants of Battery Mount Vernon. Joggers run along the river. Where the wartime flagpole had been, there is a new flagpole, raised on October 5, 2007, in honor of the post's old box number. Beside it stands a bronze plaque, dedicated that same morning by then Representative Jim Moran of Virginia. The plaque records that the men of Post Office Box 1142 had advanced the nation's interests and uncovered vital secrets without resorting to sleep deprivation, electrical shock, or waterboarding. Their captives, the plaque reads, were never sexually abused, humiliated, or tortured. The two principal books on the program now sit on library shelves around the country. Robert K. Sutton's Nazis on the Potomac, published in 2021, was the first full-length history of the Post and was written by the former chief historian of the National Park Service, who had personally overseen the oral history project. Bruce Henderson's Sons and Soldiers, published in 2017, became a New York Times bestseller and brought the larger Ritchie Boys story to a wider American audience. The German filmmaker Christian Bauer's 2004 documentary, The Ritchie Boys, was shortlisted for the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. The Israeli directors Mor Lushi and Daniel Sivan made a 36-minute Netflix documentary in 2021, Camp Confidential, featuring Peter Weiss and Arno Meyer, two of the last surviving morale officers, speaking in their own voices. Stephen Kleinman, the interrogator-turned-scholar who had written the first thesis, became a leading public expert in the post-September 11 debate over interrogation. Drawing explicitly on the Fort Hunt archive, Kleinman testified before Congress that coercive methods were both unethical and operationally less productive than rapport-based ones. His argument was simply the argument the old men of Post Office Box 1142 had been making in their quiet living rooms in Honolulu and Detroit and Louisville. They had run the experiment, on the largest scale in American history, against the most fanatical adversaries of the 20th century. They knew which method worked. The men themselves are gone now, almost all of them. Henry Colm died on July 29, 2010. Werner Moritz died in 2010. Harold George Mandel died on July 15, 2011. Fred Michel passed away within a few years of the 2007 reunion. John Gunther Dean died on June 6, 2019. Arno Meyer died on December 18, 2023. Guy Stern, the Camp Ritchie graduate and frontline interrogator who carried the public memory of the broader Ritchie Boys into the 21st century, died in the Detroit area on December 7, 2023. At the age of 101, on the 82nd anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the day that had set their unlikely path in motion. Their story is not the story of a battlefield victory. It is not a story of a great fleet action or a charge across an open field. It is something quieter and, in some ways, more difficult. It is the story of a generation of refugees who were given an extraordinary chance, and who, faced every day with the men who served the regime that had tried to murder their families, chose deliberately not to become like them. They sat across chessboards from German colonels and asked them about their hometowns and their schooling and their favorite music. They walked German rocket scientists through department stores in Washington. They listened, behind hidden microphones, while men who had bombed London and shelled Murmansk argued in their cells about cigarette rations. From those games, and those walks, and those overheard arguments, the United States learned the operational details of the Schnorchel, the location of the V-2 production line, the design of infrared proximity fuses, and the entire intelligence picture the Wehrmacht had built up of the Soviet Union. The intelligence flowed for 3 years. The methods were patient. The methods were lawful. The methods were, in their own quiet way, a form of moral defiance against the regime that had built the camps from which many of the interrogators had escaped as children. Then, when the war ended, those men closed their files and went home and built ordinary American lives. They became professors, ambassadors, scientists, bureaucrats, food service directors, magnet engineers. They voted, they raised children, they mowed their lawns, they taught classes. They never said a word. For 60 years, an invisible army of more than 500 Americans on the official Fort Hunt rosters carried in their heads the precise details of one of the most successful intelligence programs of the 20th century. They carried it because they had given their word, And when at last a young park ranger came knocking on their doors and the United States Army gave them permission to speak, they did so with the same care and the same dignity they had shown 30-year-old colonels of the Wehrmacht in 1944. They did not boast. They did not exaggerate. They sat down with a tape recorder and a Park Service interviewer, and they told the truth, plainly, about what an American interrogation room could be when it was run by people who refused to surrender their humanity. That was the gift they left behind. That, in the end, is what the bronze plaque at the foot of the Fort Hunt flagpole was put there to remember.